Chapter 1: The Mysterious Call. The rain fell heavily that cold night, covering the city with a cloak of shadows and secrets. Neon lights reflected in the puddles, creating an eerie glow on the deserted streets. In the heart of this bleak scene, inside a cramped and dimly lit office, sat Detective Jack Malone. Jack was a man marked by time and battles, both physical and emotional. His wrinkled clothes and tired eyes told stories of sleepless nights and complicated cases. He was sitting in his worn leather chair, with a half-empty bottle of bourbon and a nearly finished cigarette. The clock struck midnight when the old phone on his desk rang, the sharp sound cutting through the silence of the night. Jack answered on the third ring, his voice hoarse and deep like an echo in the darkness. Malone speaking. On the other end, a tense female voice responded, almost a whisper. "Detective, I need your help. Something terrible is happening at the Lancaster Hotel. Room 207. Before he could ask anything, the line went dead. Jack sat in silence for a moment, feeling the urgency in the woman's voice. He grabbed his coat, adjusted his hat, and left, with the rain as his constant companion. The Lancaster Hotel was in the city center, a building that had seen better days. The walls were stained with dampness, and the neon sign flickered like a dying old man. Jack entered the lobby, where a half-asleep doorman tried in vain to stop his progress. He climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, smelling mold and decay. When he reached room 207, the door was ajar. Jack pushed it open slowly, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. The body of a man lay on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. The victim, a middle-aged man, had an expression of horror frozen on his face. In his hand he held a torn letter, and beside him, a partially burned old photograph. Jack knelt down, examining the details with an experienced eye. Every clue, every detail told a part of the story. But there was something more, something he couldn't yet see, hidden in the shadows. He stood up and looked around the room, feeling the presence of death and despair. He took the letter and the photo, putting them in his coat pocket. His mind was already starting to formulate questions, to seek answers. But one thing was certain. This case was just beginning, and the truth was buried under layers of lies and secrets. Jack left the room, knowing that the investigation awaiting him would be anything but simple. But he was ready. He always was. Chapter 2: Crime Scene. The city clock struck 1 a.m. as Jack Malone descended the stairs of the Lancaster Hotel, his mind teeming with questions and hypotheses. The night had grown colder and the rain more insistent, as if the city were trying to wash away the accumulated sins of its streets. He stopped at the reception desk, where the elderly doorman was now fully awake, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "What do you know about the man in room 207? Jack asked, his voice a muffled thunder in the dim lobby. The doorman swallowed hard, wringing his hands. "He arrived last night, didn't say much, paid in cash and went straight to the room. No one came to visit him, as far as I've seen." Jack nodded, absorbing the information. He looked around and noticed a young woman with a nervous expression watching from a corner. She wore a maid's uniform and held a cleaning bucket as if it were a shield. "You, come here," Jack called. The maid approached hesitantly, her eyes filled with anxiety. "I'm Jack Malone. Did you see or hear anything unusual tonight?" She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the floor. I heard an argument in room 207 earlier. A male and a female voice. I couldn't make out much, but it sounded serious." Jack frowned, thanked her, and went back up to room 207. He knew that every second counted and that any clue could be crucial. Back at the crime scene, he began to examine the place more thoroughly. The room was simple, with worn-out furniture and heavy curtains that barely let the streetlight in. He focused on the torn letter in the victim's hand. The words were few and cryptic. Meeting at the Lancaster. Secret revealed. He put the letter in his pocket, knowing an expert would need to analyze it later. The old photograph was also intriguing. It showed a young woman with a melancholic look, the background a familiar old city park. Jack felt that the answer to this mystery was tied to this woman and the dark past the photo hinted at. As he scoured the room, he noticed a subtle detail. A strand of blonde hair on the pillow, a clue that might belong to the woman the maid mentioned. Jack carefully picked up the strand, preserving it as evidence. Suddenly, a shadow moved outside the window. Jack went over, but the figure vanished into the night's darkness. Someone was watching, perhaps the killer or an important witness. He knew he needed to stay alert and one step ahead to unravel this case. Jack closed the door to room 207, determined to follow every lead to the end. The game of lies was just beginning, and he was ready to face every twist and turn that lay ahead. Chapter 3. First Suspects. The night crept by slowly, each second dragging like a criminal about to be exposed. Jack Malone left the Lancaster Hotel and headed to the police station, where the atmosphere was tense with hushed murmurs. The interrogation room was dimly lit, perfect for the mental confrontations to come. The first to be interrogated was the corrupt politician, Charles Wainwright, a robust middle-aged man with an air of arrogance and an expensive suit that barely concealed his disdain. "Mr. Wainwright, what were you doing at the Lancaster Hotel tonight?" Jack began, his voice calm but laden with authority. Charles adjusted his tie, casting a look of contempt. "Detective, I have business to attend to. I don't need to justify my actions to you." Jack gave a sideways smile, a cold and calculating one. "Business like threatening someone? Because it seems someone had a fatal encounter." Charles remained silent, his eyes shifting for a brief moment. Jack mentally noted this hesitation, knowing a man like Charles always had something to hide. Next in line was the cabaret singer, Lola Fontaine. She entered the room with an air of tragedy, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. She sat gracefully, crossing her legs with elegance. "Lola, did you know the victim?" Jack asked, leaning slightly forward. She sighed, a sad and soft sound. "Yes, I knew him. He was a regular at the cabaret. Always seemed troubled, like he was running from something." Jack felt the sincerity in her voice but knew everyone had secrets. "And tonight? What did you see or hear?" Lola bit her lip, hesitating. "I saw Charles Wainwright arguing with him earlier. I don't know about what, but it seemed serious. Later, I heard a woman screaming." Jack noted the information, knowing every detail could be crucial. The last to be interrogated was the mysterious foreigner, a man with an indistinguishable accent and a disquieting presence. His name was Victor Petrov, and he had a gaze that seemed to pierce the soul. "Victor, what were you doing at the Lancaster Hotel tonight?" Jack asked, keeping his gaze steady. Victor smiled slightly, an enigmatic smile. "Business, detective. Always business." "Business that involves murder?" Jack retorted, without blinking. Victor didn't respond immediately, just maintained his smile, heightening the tension in the room. "Let's say that sometimes business gets complicated." Jack knew Victor was a dangerous player, someone who navigated between truth and lies with ease. He had the feeling Victor knew more than he was letting on. With the interrogations concluded, Jack returned to his office, his thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. 3 suspects, each with motives and secrets. He needed more clues, more connections to unravel this web of lies. And time was against him. Chapter 4. The Game of Lies. Jack Malone sat in his office, the dim light from the lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. The suspect's statements echoed in his mind, each phrase, each hesitation, each diverted glance. He knew that hidden among those lies was the thread of truth. But which one of them was lying? Or worse, were they all lying? The phone on the corner of the desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. He answered quickly, his deep voice carrying the impatience of a man hungry for answers. Malone. Detective, this is the forensic expert. We found something interesting on the torn letter you found. Remnants of a name. It looks like Eliza. Jack thanked him and hung up, the gears in his mind turning faster. The name Eliza now became a central piece of the puzzle. He decided to visit the cabaret where Lola Fontaine worked. The place was a typical refuge for lost souls, where alcohol and jazz music muffled the silent screams of despair. Lola was on stage, her voice soft and sad, enveloping the hall in a melancholic melody. After the performance, Jack approached her backstage. Lola, I need you to be honest with me. Who is Eliza? Lola trembled at the mention of the name, her eyes revealing a mix of fear and sadness. Eliza, she was a close friend, disappeared a few months ago. I thought she was dead. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The piece was fitting, but the picture was still incomplete. Determined to confront Charles Wainwright again, Jack drove to the politician's mansion. The door was opened by a taciturn butler who led him to the luxurious library. Charles was sitting, drinking an expensive whiskey, his expression exuding confidence. Charles, tell me about Eliza. Jack's voice was a command, not a question. Charles frowned, but his gaze betrayed a flicker of recognition. Eliza was a complication. She knew too much about my business dealings. I thought she was out of the picture. And now she's dead, Charles. And you're at the center of this mess. Jack didn't back down, keeping the pressure on. Charles remained silent, guilt etching lines into his face. Returning to the station, Jack decided to confront Viktor Petrov one last time. The foreigner was in the interrogation room, more enigmatic than ever. Victor, who is Eliza to you? Jack asked directly, watching every micro-expression. Victor smiled slightly, but there was something in his eyes, a genuine sadness. Eliza was my sister. She came here looking for a new life but found trouble. Big trouble. Jack felt a tightness in his chest. The victim, Eliza, was connected to all the suspects in different but deadly ways. And now, the game of lies was revealing itself to be ever more complex. With these new revelations, Jack knew the truth was close. But he also knew that someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. Chapter 5: The Revelation. The night was dark and silent, broken only by the sound of quick footsteps echoing on the wet streets. Jack Malone walked with determination, his mind focused on the new clues. The revelation that Eliza was at the center of this mystery had changed everything. He needed to find out more about her past, who she was, and why everyone seemed to want something from her. He went to Eliza's old apartment, a rundown building in the city's shadiest neighborhood. The door was locked, but Jack had his ways. With a skillful click, he unlocked the door and entered. The place was covered in dust, abandoned, but it still held the marks of Eliza's life. Framed photos on the walls, an unmade bed, and a table with scattered papers. Among the papers, Jack found a diary. He flipped through the pages quickly, his eyes hungry for any information. Eliza wrote about her fear, about how she was running from something big, something that could destroy many lives. Then he found a recent entry. I trusted Victor. He promised to protect me, but now I know I'm in danger. Charles threatened me, said I knew too much. If anything happens to me, look for Lola. She's the only one who knows the truth. Jack closed the diary, his mind spinning with the new information. He needed to get back to the cabaret and talk to Lola one more time. She was the key to unraveling this web of lies. The cabaret was almost empty, with only a few lost souls and the band playing a sad melody. Lola was at the bar, a glass of gin in her hand. When she saw Jack, her face twisted in a mixture of fear and resignation. "Lola, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. She nodded, leading him to a more private corner. "I found Eliza's diary. She wrote that you knew the truth," Jack began, watching Lola's every reaction. Lola sighed deeply, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Eliza was involved in something dangerous. She discovered a corruption scheme involving Charles Wainwright and Victor Petrov. They were smuggling information and money, using the city as their playground. Eliza wanted to expose everything, but she knew she was in danger. Jack felt the weight of Lola's words. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but something was still missing. Why did she trust Victor? Jack asked, his voice grave. Lola looked down, her voice a whisper. Because he was her brother. She thought he would protect her, but she was wrong. He used her to get what he wanted and then left her to die. Jack felt the anger burning inside him. He knew Victor was dangerous, but using his own sister was a level of cruelty he hadn't expected. He needed to confront Victor one last time. As he left the cabaret, Jack realized he was being followed. The figure in the shadows tried to remain discreet, but Jack was alert. He quickly turned a corner, drawing his gun and preparing for the ambush. The pursuer emerged, a man with a grim face and cold eyes. Jack quickly disarmed him, pressing him against the wall. "Who sent you?" Jack growled, his voice full of menace. "Victor. He knows you're too close to the truth," the man whispered before Jack knocked him out. Jack knew time was running out. He needed to act fast before Victor could escape. The revelation was complete, and now it was time to expose the conspiracy and bring justice for Eliza. Chapter 6. Conspiracy Unveiled. The night was at its peak, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Jack Malone moved through the deserted streets, determined to close the case. Every shadow, every sound, was a reminder that he was playing a deadly game. He knew where to find Victor Petrov. The old abandoned factory in the industrial district was the perfect place for a man like Victor, full of secrets and dangers. Jack arrived at the location and turned off the car's headlights. The building was a sinister silhouette against the night sky, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. He entered cautiously, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. Inside the factory, the sound of footsteps echoed off the walls. Jack followed the sounds, moving like a predator in enemy territory. He knew Victor was waiting. The question was he alone? Turning a corner, he saw Victor, imposing and confident, standing next to a table with scattered documents. Victor's expression was one of pure coldness, but his eyes gleamed with a mixture of recognition and challenge. "Jack Malone, I knew you'd show up," Victor said, his voice like smooth poison. "You went too far, Victor. Eliza trusted you, and you betrayed her," Jack replied, keeping his gun steady but still lowered. Victor laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Eliza was naive. This game is bigger than you can imagine. Charles, me. We're just pieces of a much larger puzzle." Jack stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Victor. "And you'll pay for every lie, every death." Before Victor could respond, a gunshot echoed through the air. Jack felt a sharp pain in his shoulder and dropped to his knees. A second man emerged from the shadows, a smoking gun in hand. Jack recognized the thug who had followed him earlier. "You're finished, Malone?" Victor said, advancing slowly, his voice laden with triumph. But Jack wasn't someone who gave up easily. With a swift movement, he drew a second gun from his ankle holster and fired, hitting the thug in the chest. The surprise in Victor's eyes was evident, and he tried to draw his own gun, but Jack was faster. A precise shot, and Victor fell, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the pain throbbing in his shoulder, but knowing he had won this round. With Victor and his thug neutralized, Jack began to sift through the documents on the table. They were irrefutable evidence of corruption, smuggling, and money laundering schemes. Everything Eliza had tried to expose was there, waiting to be uncovered. As police sirens echoed in the distance, Jack gathered the documents and left the factory, staggering but victorious. The truth was finally in sight, and Eliza would have her justice. Chapter 7 Climax. Jack Malone staggered out of the abandoned factory, the sound of approaching police sirens growing louder. With his wounded shoulder throbbing in pain, he knew he didn't have much time before reinforcements arrived. The documents he had found on Victor's table were the key to bringing down the entire network of corruption and conspiracy that had claimed so many lives, including Eliza's. Leaning against a lamppost, Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm the pain and fatigue. The police car pulled up, and 2 officers ran toward him. Among them was Lieutenant Samantha Ortiz, a longtime ally. "Jack, what the hell happened here?" Samantha asked, concern evident in her eyes as she helped Jack stay on his feet. "Victor Petrov. He and Charles Wainwright were behind it all. They used Eliza." Jack handed the documents to her, his fingers stained with blood. Samantha quickly glanced at the papers, her face growing more serious with each page. "We need to get you to a hospital," she signaled to one of the officers. "No," Jack interrupted, his voice firm despite the pain. "Not until I'm sure Charles is arrested." Samantha hesitated for a moment, but the determination in Jack's eyes convinced her. She nodded to the officers. "Let's go to Charles's house. We need to confront him with these proofs." On the way to Charles Wainwright's mansion, Jack felt the weight of the entire investigation. Every sacrifice, every lead followed, culminated in this moment. Wainwright's mansion was a symbol of his power and corruption, a fortress that Jack was determined to bring down. Arriving at the location, Jack and Samantha advanced cautiously. The gate was open, indicating that Charles already knew his time was up. They entered the quiet house, their steps echoing off the ornate walls. In the luxurious office, Charles sat behind his desk, a look of resignation and disdain on his face. "Detective Malone, I see you made it to the end," Charles said, his voice icy. Jack approached, ignoring the growing pain in his shoulder. "This is the end of the line for you, Wainwright. You and Victor paid the ultimate price for your lies. Eliza tried to expose you, and you killed her for it." Jack threw the documents onto Charles's desk. Charles glanced at the papers for a moment before laughing softly. "You think this is enough to bring me down? I have allies, detective. People who will ensure I stay in power." Before Jack could respond, a gunshot echoed through the room. Charles fell back, a bloody hole in his chest. Jack looked toward the door, where Victor stood, barely keeping himself upright, a gun trembling in his hand. "I won't let you destroy any more lives, Charles," Victor said before turning the gun on himself. Jack rushed forward, but it was too late. Victor pulled the trigger, falling beside Charles, both dead in a pool of blood. The room fell silent, only the sound of Jack and Samantha's heavy breathing filling the air. The truth had finally been revealed, but at a terrible cost. Chapter 8. Resolution. The dawn began to paint the sky in pale shades of pink and orange as Jack Malone stepped out of Charles Wainwright's mansion. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic aroma of blood. The weight of the previous night's events pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew that justice had finally been served. The sirens of the police and the flashes of reporters' cameras blended into a deafening cacophony. Samantha Ortiz was by his side, supporting him as paramedics approached to tend to his wound. She held his hand for a moment, her eyes filled with respect and gratitude. "You did what needed to be done, Jack. Eliza can finally rest in peace." Jack only nodded, too exhausted to respond. He knew Samantha was right, but the victory had a bitter taste. Too many lives had been destroyed. Too many lies had been told. He looked at the crowd of reporters, knowing that the story they would tell was only a fraction of the truth. Hours later, after being treated at the hospital, Jack returned to his small office. The familiarity of the environment brought a sense of normalcy, but he knew that nothing would be the same. He sat at his desk, lit a cigarette, and looked at the corkboard on the wall, where photos and newspaper clippings of the case were pinned. Eliza's face looked back at him from one of the photos, and Jack felt a wave of sadness. He picked up the photo and placed it on the desk, next to his bottle of bourbon. The door opened, and Lola Fontaine entered, her eyes still red from crying. She sat in the chair opposite Jack, holding a handkerchief. "I wanted to thank you for everything you did for Eliza, Jack. She was like a sister to me." Jack nodded, stubbing out the cigarette in the ashtray. "She deserved justice, Lola, and I promised myself I'd find the truth, no matter the cost." Lola smiled sadly, a solitary tear rolling down her face. "She would be proud of you." The two sat in silence for a moment, sharing the pain and relief of the case's conclusion. Jack knew that despite the victory, the internal battle was far from over. There were always more shadows to face, more secrets to uncover. As Lola stood up to leave, Jack's phone rang. He answered it, the voice on the other end calm and familiar. "Malone, we've got a new case. Looks like someone didn't like your last investigation." Jack sighed, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He knew there would be no rest for him, not while there were lies to uncover and injustices to right. "I'm on my way." He hung up the phone, put on his hat, and left the office. The city was still awake, full of secrets and mysteries, and Jack Malone was ready to face them. Chapter 9. Epilogue. The rising sun painted the city with a palette of golden and soft hues. Jack Malone walked the streets with determined steps, though exhaustion was visible on his face. The city, still waking up, was unaware of the dramatic events that had unfolded the previous night. People began their routines, oblivious to the battles fought in the shadows. Jack entered his office, the small space now more familiar and comforting than ever. He sat at his desk, where Eliza's photo still rested, a constant reminder of the truth he had uncovered. The bottle of bourbon remained, but Jack decided to leave it untouched this time. The door opened, and Samantha Ortiz entered, bringing with her a folder full of documents. She placed the folder on the desk and sat down, a tired but sincere smile on her face. "Jack, you did it. The whole city is talking about the downfall of Charles Wainwright and Victor Petrov," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Jack nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Eliza's photo. "It was a long night, Sam. But now, finally, the truth is out there." Samantha picked up one of the documents and began to read it, her eyes serious. "Yes, but there's more. During the investigation, we found connections to other unresolved cases. It looks like the corruption network is bigger than we thought. We need to keep going." Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the new mission fall on his shoulders. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't give up. "I'm ready. Let's finish this once and for all," he said with renewed determination. Samantha smiled, admiring Jack's resilience. "I knew I could count on you." As she stood up to leave, Jack picked up the phone and began making calls. He needed to gather his team, prepare for the next phase of the investigation. Each call, each conversation was a step toward justice. Hours later, as night began to fall again, Jack left the office, his mind focused on what lay ahead. The streets were now full of life, but he knew that in the shadows, there were still many secrets to uncover. He paused for a moment, looking at the city skyline, and felt a strange sense of peace. Jack knew that no matter how difficult it was, he would keep fighting. For Eliza, for all those who had been wronged, and for those who still didn't know the truth. With one last look at the city, Jack put on his hat and disappeared into the night, ready to face the challenges to come. Chapter 10. A New Call. Night was falling again over the city, painting the buildings and streets a deep blue. Neon lights began to shine, creating a vibrant contrast with the growing darkness. Jack Malone was in his office, surrounded by documents and notes. The smoke from his cigarette danced in the air as he reviewed the final details of the recently resolved case. But his mind was already on the next battle, the next puzzle to be solved. The old phone on his desk rang, a sharp sound that cut through the silence of the room. Jack answered on the second ring, feeling a familiar sense of urgency. "Malone speaking." The voice on the other end was feminine, soft but filled with concern. "Detective Malone, my name is Evelyn Hart. I need your help. Something terrible has happened." Jack listened carefully, picking up every nuance of her voice. There was fear, but also a determination he knew well. "Go on, Miss Hart. What happened?" "It's my brother. He's disappeared, and I found—" She hesitated, as if seeking courage to continue. "I found a message from him saying he was in danger. He mentioned the name of a man. A name I know you're familiar with, Charles Wainwright." The name made Jack's heart beat faster. He thought that, with Charles's death, the secrets had been buried. But it seemed the shadows of the past still cast long shadows over the present. "Where are you now, Miss Hart?" Jack asked, his voice firm. "I'm at home, but I can't stay here. I feel like I'm being watched." Jack jotted down the address and stood up, grabbing his coat and hat. He knew he needed to act quickly. Every second counted. "I'm on my way. Don't leave the house and don't open the door for anyone until I get there," he instructed, hanging up. As he drove through the dark streets of the city, Jack thought about the implications of what he had just heard. Charles Wainwright was dead, but his actions, his secrets were still alive. He knew this new case wouldn't be simple, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Evelyn Hart needed him, and he wouldn't fail her. Arriving at the address, Jack saw a young woman waiting on the porch, her eyes full of fear and expectation. He got out of the car and approached, the sound of his steps echoing in the quiet night. "Miss Hart?" he called, and she nodded, running to him. "Detective Malone. Thank you for coming so quickly. Let's go inside and talk." "I need all the details," he said, guiding her into the house. As she recounted the story of her brother, Jack realized this would be a complicated case. But he was ready. He always was. He lit another cigarette, looked into Evelyn's eyes and said, "We'll find your brother, and we'll find out what really happened." The night was still young, and the detective knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. But Jack Malone was back in the game, ready to face whatever came his way.